So, it's been an interesting year, but you know what's more interesting than that? Maps. So, let's get into it. And I admit I may have bit off a bit more than I can chew initially. I mean, attempting to make a map that shows language, ethnicity, culture, and religion? What was I thinking? East Asian countries may look rather easy because of their seeming homogeneity, but these are actually some of the most religiously diverse and complex countries in the entire world. Now, just what is the religious makeup of East Asian nations like Mongolia, China, Korea, and Japan? Well, you might be tempted to say that they're Buddhists, as is commonly depicted in American media. However, the situation is much more complicated than that. Although many in this region may call themselves Buddhist on paper, the actual religious, cultural, and spiritual practices of these people groups are linked to many different diverse faiths. For instance, in China, officially the bulk of the population is irreligious, but the vast majority still retain some aspects from the native animist practices and traditional ancestral venerations, while throwing in some Buddhist and Taoist influences as well. In Japan, many identify as either Buddhist, Shinto, or both, although Japan is also one of the least religious countries on earth, making many of the Buddhist or Shinto beliefs and practices essentially non theistic in a way. Because of this, the idea of religion is much more fluid and more of a melting pot of ideas, practices, and beliefs in this region, rather than having cut and dry distinctions as you would assume for much of the world. So I tried to do something similar to what I did in Africa and Europe when attempting to delineate certain religious subsections of various ethnic groups, but this was, of course, much more challenging. I mean, what even is the religion of North Koreans? Worship of the Kim family? I did what I thought made the most sense and had more of a dualistic approach, dividing South Koreans between Buddhists and Christians, while dividing Japan between Buddhists and Shintoists, even though there is a massive amount of crossover between them and adherence to organized religion is low in both countries. With China, I decided to divide up between the different dialect groupings of the Han Chinese ethnic group in the south, such as the Hakka, Cantonese, Min, and Wu, and the Jin dialect group in the north, as well as distinguishing the Han of Taiwan, who have drifted considerably from the mainlanders culturally, and a large percentage of Taiwanese Han have some minor ancestry from the Aboriginal people of Taiwan, who are actually descended from the original Austronesians before they swept throughout Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia also has a massive population of Han Chinese who have been migrating to Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines for hundreds of years, but are mostly descended from immigrants after the 18th century, and many can still trace their ancestry back to their hometown, since ancestry is considered extremely important to the Han Chinese, even in the diaspora. What's interesting is that many Chinese anthropologists largely consider the Tai Kadai or Kra Dai languages to actually be a branch of the Sino-Tibetan family, but this is pretty widely rejected by most other observers, with some linguists actually considering the Austronesian, Thai, Mon Khmer, and sometimes the Hmong Mien families to be descended from a single family from southern China known as Austric, which is an interesting proposal but lacks concrete evidence as of now. My opinion, I have no idea. I'm not a linguist, but to me a single origin for the peoples of Southeast Asia does make sense, but there doesn't seem to be too much evidence for it at the moment. A similar massive proposed language family, Altaic, including Turkic, Mongolian, Tungusic, and sometimes Japanese and Korean languages, has largely been rejected by linguists for being too simplistic, as although there is strong evidence that these ethno-linguistic groups interacted and borrowed from each other in the past, it seems unlikely that they all descended from one family. The Austronesian portion of Southeast Asia is now more detailed on the map, and you might be able to recognize some of the more well-known groups such as the Malays, Aceh, Javanese, Balinese, Madurese, Sundanese, Visayan, Bicolano, and Tagalog peoples. By the way, it's often taught in Malaysian, Indonesian, and even Filipino schools that Austronesians actually originated in Malaysia and spread outwards from there, hence the archaic term for the Malay race. But this is based on outdated theories and is quite simply not true. Based on our current and most accurate information, Austronesians did originate from Taiwan, and spread south to the Malay archipelago rather than the other way around, and it's pretty airtight. I could do a whole video based on modern day historical misconceptions, but they're normally tied to some sort of ultra nationalist belief system that cements in the minds of the youth before it can be corrected. However, some of the islands on the map, such as Mindanao, Sulawesi, and Sumatra, could definitely use a bit more distinctions, which is why I should probably point out that I will be making improvements to these maps before I release the final product. Yes, I know including Serbs and Croats together under one group was a bad idea. I get it, you guys told me. In recent years, there has been a large exodus from the crowded island of Java, which is in fact the most densely populated large island in the world, into other parts of the Indonesian archipelago, in particular Sumatra, with Javanese now making up more than 1/4 of the population of that island, and in Kalimantan, making up over 1/10 of the population. And this trend was pushed by the Indonesian government since the 1950s, with nearly a fifth of the Javanese population, or nearly 20 million people, having settled in Sumatra, Kalimantan, Papua, Sulawesi, or the Sunda Islands. As a matter of fact, it's even been proposed that the nation's capital be shifted from Jakarta to southern Kalimantan due to the much lower population density, similar to how Myanmar or Brazil moved its capital further inland. These factors make Indonesia possibly one of the most bizarrely diverse countries in all of Asia, with Austronesian Christians, Muslims, and Hindus living side by side, in addition to the extremely distinct Papuans in the east. One thing you'll notice if you zoom in is that I've switched Polynesians and Micronesians from the Oceanic category, as many were repeatedly asking why I would include them in this group when genetically they are closer to Eastern Eurasians than Papuans or Aborigines, as I've pointed out in previous videos. I guess it was just a force of habit since the US Census considers them to be separate from Asians, although I suppose technically they would be considered multiracial since they are considerably mixed between Melanesians, Austronesians, as well as Japanese and Europeans to a lesser extent. Moluccans of eastern Indonesia would be a multiracial group as well, but they lean more towards the Melanesian side than the Asian side genetically. It's a complex situation, as it is in Madagascar, Central Asia, the Horn of Africa, and South Asia, where many wildly divergent groups have been mixing together for thousands of years. It's also important to distinguish various Pacific Island groups, such as the Tahitians, Fijians, Samoans, Tongans, and Maori, never know if I'm saying that right, who all live in the South Pacific and yet have very different cultures and practices from each other and varying foreign influences as well. The most diverse islands in the South Pacific are definitely New Caledonia and the islands of Fiji, which I've highlighted in a past video, are an interesting example of colonial transplants, with southern New Caledonia having a large French and Southeast Asian population, while neighboring Fiji has a massive South Asian population left over from laborers brought in by the British Empire. This has led to conflict in recent years as many Indo-Fijians feel ostracized by recent political administrations, leading to a mass exodus to English-speaking countries like Australia, the US, New Zealand, and Canada, while the French descendants in New Caledonia have a massive problem in that the Kanaks, or indigenous Caledonians, have been pushing for independence. As for the island of Papua, well, it's not called the most diverse place on Earth for no reason. This current map I have is a massive oversimplification of the various ethno-linguistic and religious groups that are native to the island. If it were actually realistic, there would be hundreds of different groups mapped out on this island that you and I couldn't even begin to name. For most linguistic groups on the island of Papua, linguists and anthropologists still have no idea how to classify them. However, it is known that trade, migration, and intermixing with Austronesians birthed a variety of different groups on the island and in neighboring archipelagos, including Hirimotu, which is an Austronesian Creole spoken as a lingua franca in the southeastern portion of the island. And although I attempted to classify the indigenous people of the island, there is still a lot of work to do. I divided the Papuans between the Eastern Highlanders, the TNG family, and just kind of threw all the rest into one group. I'll definitely be improving on this before the release of the final map. With Australia, you'll notice it's a bit different because I distinguished the old stock Anglo-Celtic descendants who arrived in Australia before the 20th century from more recent British migrants. These are the ones who are descended from, the prisoners everyone likes to talk about. Although there were large non prisoner colonies back then as well, and similarly to many Americans, their ancestors have been heavily mixed between English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and Cornish immigrants. And most wouldn't even really be able to tell you what their exact ancestry is or how long their family's been in the country for. And if you don't know, British people really love Australia. So there's loads of more recent British migrants as well who settled down there. And there's a more recent, albeit massive, Asian population, mostly confined to large metropolitan areas, as well as a rapidly growing multiracial population from mixing between natives, Europeans, and Asians, although they aren't really large enough to show up on the map. This is similar to what I plan on doing in America and Canada, but the history of European settlement goes back much further than in Australia and New Zealand, which didn't have a large-scale European settlement into the mid-1800s, which is why their cultures are so different from that of the former British colonies in North America, which have a radically different pattern of European settlement and migration, but we'll get into that in the next video. Just like in my previous videos, because of the nature of the map, we can change the parameters to make it as complex or as simple as we please. So you can see Buddhist, Christian, and Islamic groups, or simply grouped together by language family. I'll probably be writing another portfolio of sorts like last time, where I explain my reasoning for some of the classifications, and also give a few facts on these groups like their cultural, linguistic, religious, and genetic makeup. But remember, I'm just a one-man show here. It's literally just me, so it might take me a while to get to it considering how many more people groups I included this year. I think my first map had like 70 or 80 different groups, while this one will be closer to 500 or 600 in much greater detail too. So yeah, it's going to take me quite a bit longer to wrap that up. I truly do appreciate your patience and support. I know I've been gone for a really long time. It's nice to finally see the old world coming together. The new world is next. Keep your eye out for my next map on North America. It's gonna get spicy. As always, thank you all so much for watching. This has been Mason. I'll see you next time.